You are lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. You have an idea for a business, a book, or a completely new career path. It is something you genuinely want to do. You have bought the domain name. You have opened the blank document. You have told a few close friends about it. But when you finally sit down to begin, a sudden, heavy exhaustion washes over you. You decide to clean the kitchen first. Then you check your emails. Then you scroll through your phone. Hours pass. The day ends and you haven't taken a single step forward. You feel a familiar, quiet shame settle into your chest. Personality changes rarely happen overnight in dramatic cinematic moments. They happen so gradually that people almost never notice them taking place. They begin as ordinary behaviors, which turn into daily repetitions, which create subtle psychological effects, which slowly calcify into the traits we eventually call our personality. The question we have to ask is not simply why you feel stuck, but rather, what if some parts of your personality are not simply who you are, but what you have practiced for a very long time? Think of the mind like a path through a forest. Walking through the forest once doesn't create much of a path, but walk in the same direction every day and the grass slowly bends. The soil compacts. Eventually, the path becomes easier to follow than the untouched woods around it. The brain can work in a similar way. What we repeatedly practice can become easier to repeat. Repeated behaviors and thought patterns can deeply influence our attention, our emotional responses, our expectations, our habits, our self-perception, our coping patterns, and our automatic reactions. This does not mean that your personality is completely determined by your habits, or that your struggles are entirely your fault. Personality is incredibly complex. The goal here is not to suggest a deterministic transformation, but to explain how gradual influence works. Because once you understand how your brain learns to fear starting, you can begin to teach it something else. You have wanted to learn a new language for years. You download the app, but every time you open it to practice, you feel incredibly foolish making mistakes. Instead of continuing, you close the app and tell yourself you are just too tired today. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the difficulty of the language. It is the immediate, visceral discomfort of not being immediately good at it. Maybe you call yourself a perfectionist. Maybe you think you simply lack the discipline for this specific task. Maybe you've started believing that being a slow starter is just your personality. But this is not because you are naturally incapable of learning. This is where the psychology of ego defense and all-or-nothing thinking becomes interesting. When you care deeply about something, your ego attaches its worth to the outcome. Being a beginner is inherently clumsy and error-prone. Avoiding the start creates an immediate relief from that clumsiness, and that relief can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate hesitation with safety from feeling foolish. The problem is that what protects your pride today can make the act of learning feel impossible tomorrow. You might see this bleed into your daily life. You buy expensive workout gear but never go to the gym because you don't want to look inexperienced. It is like refusing to walk up a flight of stairs because you haven't figured out how to teleport directly to the top floor. At first, you think you are just being efficient. But after months of waiting, you stop even considering the stairs. The refusal to climb doesn't keep you safe. It keeps you stuck in the lobby. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we prepare. They change our fundamental willingness to be vulnerable. If you repeatedly demand perfection before beginning, you may gradually become more comfortable with theoretical planning than messy reality. If you repeatedly refuse to be a beginner, learning may begin to feel less like a joy and more like a humiliation. If you repeatedly practice avoiding the friction of starting itself may begin to feel less possible. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have protected you from looking foolish in the past. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually have impossibly high standards. Maybe you've simply trained yourself to use perfectionism as a respectable excuse to avoid the vulnerability of being a beginner again. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced allowing yourself to be delightfully bad at something for the next year, what might become easier? You sit down to plan your new project, but instead of taking action, you spend hours researching what other people have done. You look at incredibly successful competitors and instantly feel completely overwhelmed. You tell yourself that the market is already too saturated or that someone else has already done it better. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the competition. It's the immediate, brutal assessment of your own potential that follows. Maybe you call yourself realistic. Maybe you think you're simply being analytical and avoiding a bad investment of your time. Maybe you've started believing that being overly cautious is just your personality. But this is not because you lack vision or talent. This is where the psychology of upward social comparison and preemptive rejection becomes relevant. Comparing your starting line to someone else's finish line creates a massive, intimidating gap. Dismissing your own idea before you even start creates immediate protection from future failure. And that protection can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate abandoning your goals with safety from public failure. The problem is that what gives you relief from potential judgment today can make your own internal drive feel foolish tomorrow. You might find yourself constantly talking yourself out of applying for jobs you want, convinced you aren't qualified enough. It is like standing at the edge of a diving board, staring at Olympic swimmers and deciding you shouldn't even get in the water. At first, it feels like self-preservation, but eventually you forget how to swim entirely. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we do, they change what we naturally consider ourselves capable of. If you repeatedly use other people's highlights as a weapon against your own reality, external validation may begin to feel more important than personal fulfillment. If you repeatedly talk yourself out of trying, resignation may begin to feel less like a choice and more like your destiny. If you repeatedly practice shrinking your ambitions, playing small may begin to feel less threatening than being seen. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have saved you from reckless decisions in the past. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally pessimistic. Maybe you've simply practiced preemptively rejecting yourself so no one else gets the chance to. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced focusing entirely on your own progress for the next year, what might become easier? Notice what is happening here. None of these behaviors look powerful. They look like passing thoughts. That's precisely why they are powerful. The things that shape us are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are the things we repeat so often that we stop noticing them entirely. By this point, you might be noticing something uncomfortable. Most of these behaviors, the avoiding, the comparing, the hesitating, don't feel like decisions anymore. They feel like you. That's the strange thing about repetition. At first, you choose the behavior. Eventually, the behavior can begin choosing for you. But a habit can influence your personality without defining your identity. Recognizing a pattern is not a reason to shame yourself. It is a reason to become more conscious of it. You tell your family about your new goal. They immediately respond with concern, pointing out all the risks and reasons it might fail. Instead of defending your idea, you immediately back down. You agree with them and put the project back in the drawer. And strangely, the hardest part isn't their lack of support. It's how quickly you were willing to abandon your own dream to maintain their comfort. Maybe you call yourself agreeable. Maybe you think you're simply respecting their wisdom and experience. Maybe you've started believing that being easily swayed is just your personality. But this is not because you have no convictions of your own. This is where the psychology of appeasement and emotional contagion comes into play. Standing firm in your desires, especially against the people you love, requires tolerating conflict. Backing down creates immediate social harmony and relief from tension. And that relief can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate abandoning your goals with the preservation of relationships. The problem is that what keeps the peace today can guarantee chronic internal resentment tomorrow. You might notice yourself constantly changing your major, your career path, or your hobbies based on what your partner or parents approve of. It is like a chameleon changing its colors to match a gray rock. It is incredibly effective for staying safe. But if the chameleon spends its entire life on the rock, it forgets the brilliant colors it is capable of producing. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we pursue. They change whose life we are actually living. If you repeatedly abandon your goals to appease others, you may gradually become more comfortable with self-betrayal than authentic connection. If you repeatedly prioritize social harmony over your own desires, having desires at all may begin to feel selfish. If you repeatedly practice giving your power away, taking responsibility for your own life may begin to feel like a threat. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have kept a fragile family dynamic intact. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally indecisive. Maybe you've practiced prioritizing everyone else's comfort over your own reality. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practice tolerating a little bit of social friction for the next year, what might become easier? You have spent weeks preparing for your new venture. You have the logo, the website, and the business cards, but you refuse to launch until everything feels perfectly aligned. You tell yourself you are just waiting for the right moment, a moment when you feel completely confident and fearless. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the preparation. It's the terrifying suspicion that the perfect moment is never actually going to arrive. Maybe you call yourself a planner. Maybe you think you're simply being thorough and avoiding careless mistakes. Maybe you've started believing that chronic overpreparation is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally organized. This is where the psychology of an external locus of control and the illusion of readiness becomes profound. We mistakenly believe that confidence must precede action, but psychologically, confidence is the result of action. Waiting for the fear to disappear before you start creates a perpetual holding pattern, and that waiting can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate endless preparation with actual progress. The problem is that what makes you feel productive today can completely divorce you from taking actual risks tomorrow. You might read 10 books on how to write a novel without ever writing a single paragraph. Imagine writing a sentence on a piece of paper once. It doesn't change much. Write the same sentence every day for years, however, and eventually you may stop reading it as a sentence. You may start reading it as a description of yourself. I am always getting ready, but I am never ready. The repetition has become automatic. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we prepare. They change how we define our own capability. If you repeatedly wait for fear to disappear, you may gradually become more comfortable with theoretical planning than messy reality. If you repeatedly mistake preparation for progress, taking an actual leap may begin to feel less like a natural step and more like an impossible jump. If you repeatedly practice waiting for the perfect moment, the waiting room itself may begin to feel like your only home. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have helped you excel in structured environments like school. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today, and what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually need more preparation. Maybe you've aggressively practiced using planning as a respectable excuse to avoid the vulnerability of the arena. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced taking action while still terrified for the next year, what might become easier? But there is a deeper idea underneath all of this. We have been culturally conditioned to view personality as a rigid, unchangeable code. We assume that who we are at 20 or 30 is exactly who we will be forever. But understanding this difference between who you are and what you repeatedly practice is the key to untangling your identity from your anxiety. Changing a pattern does not mean you have to completely destroy yourself to become a different person. It simply means giving yourself more choices. A steering wheel doesn't decide where a car must go. It simply gives the driver the ability to change direction when the road curves. Awareness works in a similar way. Realizing that you have been practicing these habits does not instantly teleport you to a place of perfect peace, but it gives you agency. It gives you the steering wheel back. Why does any of this matter? Because the small choices you make every single day are quietly building the architecture of your future mind. One day doesn't define you. One moment of hesitation doesn't define you. One missed opportunity doesn't define you. One bad habit doesn't define you. But what you repeatedly return to deserves your attention. The quiet ways you demand perfection, the subtle ways you compare your beginning to their end, the invisible ways you wait for fear to vanish. These are not insignificant simply because they are small. They are repeated. And repetition accumulates into a life. What are you practicing becoming? Are you practicing fear or are you practicing courage? You are allowed to rewrite the script. You are allowed to start before you are ready. You are allowed to be delightfully bad at something new. Because perhaps the person you become isn't decided in one dramatic, flawless moment of finally stepping into the spotlight. Perhaps they are being shaped quietly, gently, and in the things you do again tomorrow.